Jake Peterson sat at his desk in his Austin, Texas apartment, staring blankly at his computer screen. His coffee mug, now cold, sat untouched beside him. The project deadline was looming, and his mind was racing with thoughts of impending failure. It wasn't that Jake wasn't capable, far from it. At 32, he was a skilled software developer known for his creativity and problem-solving abilities. His co-workers often turned to him for solutions to complex issues, praising his knack for thinking outside the box. But when the pressure was on, something shifted in Jake. The confidence that fueled his best work evaporated, replaced by self-doubt and paralysis. Jake loved living in Austin, a city known for its vibrant tech scene and laid-back culture. His career had taken off quickly, landing him a coveted role at a startup working on cutting-edge AI projects. But the very environment that inspired him also felt suffocating at times. The tech industry thrived on hustle culture with 12-hour workdays and relentless deadlines. For Jake, the stakes always felt sky high, and failure wasn't an option. Jake's struggles with pressure weren't new. They had been a part of his life for as long as he could remember. Growing up in a small town in Oklahoma, Jake was the oldest of 3 siblings. His parents, while loving, had high expectations for him. His father, a former Marine, instilled in him the importance of discipline and hard work. His mother, a teacher, emphasized the value of excellence in everything he did. "If you're going to do something, do it right," his father would often say. And Jake took those words to heart. In high school, Jake excelled in academics and sports, becoming the valedictorian and captain of the soccer team. But beneath his achievements was a relentless fear of failure. Every test, every game felt like a make-or-break moment. He carried that mindset with him into college and eventually into his career. At first, his perfectionism seemed like a strength. It drove him to succeed, earning promotions and accolades early in his career. But as the projects grew bigger and the stakes higher, his internal struggles became harder to ignore. The current project was supposed to be Jake's opportunity to shine. His team had been tasked with developing a new AI tool for a major client, a project that could make or break the startup's reputation. Jake was excited about the challenge at first, eager to prove himself, but as the deadline approached, his excitement gave way to panic. The pressure manifested in familiar ways. Jake's sleep became erratic, his mind replaying worst-case scenarios late into the night. During the day, he found it hard to focus, his thoughts jumping from one unfinished task to another. He would start writing code, only to delete it moments later, convinced it wasn't good enough. His co-workers began to notice the change. "Jake, are you okay?" his colleague Emily asked during a meeting. "You've been really quiet lately." "Yeah, just a lot on my plate," Jake replied, forcing a smile. But inside, he felt like he was drowning. As the project deadline loomed closer, Jake began to imagine the worst-case scenario. He pictured himself missing the deadline, letting down his team and his boss. He imagined the client being disappointed, the project falling apart, and his reputation being tarnished. But it wasn't just professional consequences that haunted him. Jake's anxiety began to seep into his personal life. He cancelled plans with friends, too embarrassed to admit he was struggling. He avoided phone calls from his family, knowing they'd ask how the project was going. The weight of it all felt unbearable. Jake began questioning whether he was even cut out for the tech industry. "Maybe I'm just not built for this kind of pressure," he thought. One evening, after another day of staring at his computer without making progress, Jake decided to take a walk. He wandered through his Austin neighborhood, the warm evening air doing little to calm his nerves. As he passed a bookstore, a title in the window caught his eye: The Pressure Paradox: How to Thrive When the Stakes Are High. Curious, Jake stepped inside and flipped through the book. It described exactly what he was experiencing: the crushing weight of pressure, the fear of failure, and the paralysis that followed. But it also offered hope, outlining strategies for not just surviving pressure, but thriving under it. That night, Jake went home and started researching stress management and performance psychology. He stumbled upon an article written by Dr. Vincent Vale, a psychologist who specialized in helping high performers manage pressure. The article outlined practical strategies and emphasized the idea that pressure wasn't inherently bad. It was how we responded to it that made the difference. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt a flicker of optimism. Maybe he didn't have to let pressure control him. Maybe there was a way to use it to his advantage. Jake booked an appointment with Dr. Vale the next day. Jake arrived at Dr. Vincent Vale's office on a Monday afternoon, his stomach tied in knots. He hadn't been to therapy before and wasn't entirely sure what to expect. The building was modern but inviting, with large windows letting in natural light. He stepped into the waiting room and checked in with the receptionist, then sat down, nervously tapping his foot against the carpet. "Jake?" Dr. Vale's voice was warm and steady. Jake looked up to see a tall man in his mid-40s with kind eyes and a calm presence standing at the door. "Come on in." The office was a far cry from the sterile environment Jake had feared. The walls were lined with bookshelves, a few abstract art pieces hung on the walls, and a small fountain in the corner added a soft, soothing sound to the space. "So," Dr. Vale began as they sat down, "tell me a little about what brought you here today." Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. "I guess I've just been feeling completely overwhelmed," he said finally. "I'm working on this big project at work, and the pressure is, well, it's a lot. I'm stuck. I can't seem to move forward, and it's making me feel like I'm failing. I've always been someone who thrives on challenges, but this feels different." Dr. Vale nodded, his expression thoughtful. Pressure can have that effect, especially when we don't have the tools to manage it effectively. The good news is, there are ways to change that. Over the next few sessions, Dr. Vale guided Jake through an exploration of his relationship with pressure and stress. Jake quickly realized that his struggles weren't just about the current project, they were deeply rooted in his past. "When I was a kid," Jake explained during one session, "failure wasn't an option in my house. My dad was always pushing me to be the best at everything, school, sports, you name it. He wasn't mean about it, but there was this unspoken expectation that I had to be perfect. And if I messed up, I'd get this look from him like I'd let him down." Dr. Vale leaned forward slightly. "It sounds like you learned to equate pressure with the fear of failure and the fear of disappointing others." Jake nodded. "Yeah, I guess I never really thought about it that way. It's like that fear is still with me, even though my dad isn't the one I'm trying to impress anymore." Dr. Vale explained how early experiences could shape our responses to pressure later in life. When we grow up in environments where success is emphasized above all else, we can develop a perfectionistic mindset. The problem is, perfectionism doesn't leave much room for mistakes or growth. It creates a cycle of fear and avoidance. Jake sighed. "That makes a lot of sense. But how do I break the cycle? I mean, the stakes at work are real. If I fail, there are actual consequences." "That's true," Dr. Vale replied. "But the key isn't to eliminate pressure. It's to change how you respond to it. Pressure doesn't have to be the enemy. In fact, it can be a motivator if you approach it the right way." Dr. Vale introduced Jake to several strategies for managing pressure, starting with small, actionable changes. The first was reframing his mindset around pressure. "Instead of seeing pressure as a threat," Dr. Vale suggested, "try viewing it as an opportunity, a chance to grow, to test your skills, to push yourself to new heights." Jake was skeptical at first. "That's easier said than done," he said with a laugh. "It is," Dr. Vale agreed, "but like any skill, it takes practice. Let's start small. The next time you feel that wave of stress coming on, I want you to pause and ask yourself, what is this pressure telling me, and how can I use it to my advantage?" Jake also began working on grounding techniques, such as deep breathing and progressive muscle relaxation, to calm his nervous system when the pressure felt overwhelming. One of the hardest exercises for Jake was leaning into failure. Dr. Vale encouraged him to take on low-stakes challenges where failure was possible, even likely, and to reflect on what he learned from the experience. "I hate this part," Jake admitted during one session. It feels like I'm setting myself up to fail on purpose. That's the point, Dr. Vale said with a smile. The more you expose yourself to failure in manageable ways, the less power it holds over you. It's AB. After a few weeks, Jake began to make small, meaningful changes. He found himself pausing before reacting to stressful situations, using the tools Dr. Vale had taught him. During a particularly tense team meeting, Jake felt his usual wave of anxiety start to rise, but instead of letting it take over, he focused on his breathing and reframed the situation in his mind. This isn't a threat, it's a challenge. I can handle this. Later, he shared his experience with Dr. Vale. It wasn't perfect, but I didn't freeze up like I usually do. I felt in control. That's progress, Dr. Vale said. And the more you practice, the more natural it will feel. Jake knew the stakes were higher than ever. His company had just secured a significant contract with a national retailer, a client whose name alone could boost their startup's credibility in the industry. The task was clear. Jake had to lead the development of an AI-driven tool for the client and present a polished demo in just 3 weeks. It was an incredible opportunity, but one that felt equally daunting. When his manager, Lisa, informed him of the decision, her confidence in him was evident. "You're the best person for this," she said with a smile. "I trust you to deliver." Jake nodded, outwardly calm, but inside, his heart raced. Pressure like this had always been his Achilles heel, and for a moment the familiar doubts crept in. What if I can't handle it? What if I let everyone down? Instead of retreating into his usual cycle of worry and avoidance, Jake decided to approach the challenge differently. He had spent months in therapy with Dr. Vale, preparing for moments like this. It was time to put everything he'd learned into practice. The first week was critical. Jake spent hours reviewing the client's needs, ensuring he had a deep understanding of their expectations. He convened his team, sharing his vision for the project and delegating responsibilities based on their strengths. This was a departure from his old habits of trying to shoulder everything himself, a behavior that had previously left him overwhelmed and ineffective. Still, the weight of the deadline was ever present. During a brainstorming session with his team, Jake caught himself slipping into old patterns. One of his colleagues, Brian, questioned the feasibility of a key idea, and Jake felt a pang of insecurity. His inner critic began to whisper, "They think you're in over your head. You're going to fail." But instead of letting those thoughts spiral, Jake paused, took a deep breath, and reframed the situation. "Brian," he said, keeping his voice steady, "you seem to have some concerns. Let's talk through them." This simple act of leaning into discomfort rather than avoiding it turned a potentially tense moment into a collaborative breakthrough. Brian's input led to an adjustment in their approach that ultimately strengthened the project. As the days passed, the pressure intensified. Jake worked late into the evenings, balancing the demands of the project while trying to maintain the strategies he'd learned in therapy. Whenever he felt the stress mounting, he would step away from his desk and practice a grounding exercise, focusing on the sensations around him to pull himself back into the present moment. His mantra, progress, not perfection, became a lifeline. The night before the big demo, Jake found himself nitpicking the final presentation. He was tempted to stay up all night perfecting every slide, a habit he knew would leave him drained and frazzled the next day. Instead, he made a deliberate choice to step away. "It's good enough," he said aloud, a phrase that felt foreign but liberating. For the first time before a major deadline, Jake went to bed at a reasonable hour, and he slept. The morning of the presentation arrived, and Jake felt a mix of nerves and readiness. He had prepared meticulously, and for once, he trusted that his preparation would carry him through. As he stood in the conference room before the client's executive team, he felt a flicker of anxiety, but quickly steadied himself with a deep breath. The presentation began, and Jake spoke with clarity and confidence. He walked the clients through the proposed AI solution, highlighting its potential to transform their customer experience. His calm, collected demeanor set the tone for the meeting, and the room seemed to respond to his energy. Even when a particularly challenging question was posed, Jake didn't panic. He paused, collected his thoughts, and delivered a thoughtful response that demonstrated both his expertise and adaptability. When the presentation concluded, the lead executive leaned back in his chair and smiled. "This is exactly what we were hoping for," he said. "You've exceeded our expectations." Jake could hardly believe the words. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the pride. He had done it, not just survived the pressure, but thrived under it. As his team packed up their materials and exchanged congratulations, Jake took a moment to himself. He reflected on how far he'd come, not just in his career, but in his ability to navigate high-stakes situations. That evening, back in his apartment, Jake opened his journal and wrote, "Today, I proved to myself that pressure doesn't have to break me. It can push me to grow. I'm not perfect, but I'm capable. And that's enough." The experience solidified everything Jake had learned in therapy. Pressure would always be a part of his life, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable obstacle. Instead, it had become a force he could channel, a tool to sharpen his skills and drive his success. For the first time in his life, Jake felt not just capable of handling pressure, but empowered by it. Conclusion: a life transformed, and reflections of Dr. Vale. Jake sat on the balcony of his Austin apartment, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in hues of orange and pink. It had been a week since his successful presentation to the national retailer, and life felt different. The weight that once seemed to press down on him at all times had eased. He no longer felt like a man on the brink of collapse. Instead, he felt steady, capable, and most surprisingly proud. His success with the project wasn't just about the applause and praise he received afterward, although those were gratifying. It was about something much deeper. For the first time, Jake had faced pressure head-on without letting it consume him. He had learned to channel it, to use it as fuel, rather than allowing it to paralyze him. That shift, he realized, was the true victory. Jake's days began to take on a new rhythm. Mornings no longer felt like a race against time, filled with dread about what challenges lay ahead. Instead, he started each day with purpose. He began a habit of journaling, a suggestion from Dr. Vale, where he reflected on his intentions for the day and reminded himself of the tools he had at his disposal. At work, his colleagues noticed the difference almost immediately. The Jake who used to retreat into silence when things got tough was now someone who leaned into discussions, even during moments of disagreement. He sought out feedback without fear and contributed ideas with confidence. "Jake, I don't know what you've done differently, but it's working," his manager Lisa told him during their next one-on-one meeting. "You've stepped up in a way that's inspiring for the entire team." Her words hit him with a mix of pride and humility. "Honestly, Lisa, I think I finally figured out how to stop letting pressure get the best of me," he said. "It's not about being fearless. It's about knowing how to manage the fear." The changes in Jake weren't confined to the office. At home, he found himself more present and engaged. He began reaching out to friends he hadn't seen in months, making plans for dinners, hikes, and even game nights. One evening, while catching up with his old friend Brian over beers, Brian remarked, "Man, you seem like a different guy. You're so chill now. What's your secret?" Jake laughed, the sound genuine. "Therapy, man," he replied. "I've been working with this guy, Dr. Vale, and it's made all the difference. Turns out, pressure doesn't have to crush you if you know how to handle it." Brian raised his glass. "Here's to thriving under pressure," he said with a grin. Dr. Vale thought of Jake often, especially when working with clients who struggled with stress and self-doubt. In Jake, he saw the perfect example of how resilience could be cultivated through a combination of mindset shifts and practical strategies. In a presentation at a local mental health conference, Dr. Vale shared Jake's anonymized story as a case study. "Pressure itself isn't the problem," he told the audience. "It's how we perceive it and respond to it. For many of us, pressure triggers fear. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of falling short. But what if we could reframe that fear as a challenge? What if we could see pressure as an opportunity for growth? He outlined the steps Jake had taken, identifying the root of his fear, which stemmed from a history of perfectionism, learning grounding techniques to stay present during moments of high stress, reframing pressure as a motivator rather than a threat, practicing self-compassion and letting go of the need for perfection. Jake's story is a reminder that thriving under pressure isn't about being immune to stress, Dr. Vale concluded. It's about building the tools to navigate it with grace and strength. Jake's transformation was deeply personal, but the lessons it offered were universal. Pressure is a constant in life, whether it comes from work, relationships, or our own expectations. But it doesn't have to define us. As Jake reflected on his journey, he realized that the tools he had gained extended far beyond the workplace. They gave him the confidence to face challenges in all areas of his life, from navigating conflicts with friends to taking risks in his personal growth. Pressure isn't the enemy, Jake wrote in his journal one evening. It's a teacher. It shows you what you're capable of when you stop running from it and start working with it. Dr. Vale often ended his sessions with a simple question. What's one thing you can do today to move forward, even just a little? He believed that small, consistent steps were the key to lasting change, and Jake's journey had reinforced that belief. Speaking directly to his audience, Dr. Vale shared this advice. If you've ever felt like pressure is too much to bear, take a moment to pause and reframe it. Ask yourself, what is this pressure trying to teach me? How can I use it to grow? He encouraged viewers to reflect on their own relationship with stress and to consider seeking support if they felt overwhelmed. You don't have to navigate it alone, he said with a reassuring smile. Thriving under pressure is a skill, and it's one that anyone can learn. Jake's journey became more than just his own. At work, he began mentoring younger team members, sharing the techniques he'd learned and encouraging them to embrace challenges rather than fear them. His team became stronger, more collaborative, and more resilient as a result. Jake's story serves as a powerful reminder that pressure, when approached with the right mindset, can be a catalyst for growth, resilience, and success. For him, thriving under pressure wasn't just a professional triumph, it was a personal transformation. And for anyone willing to take the first step, it could be theirs too.